Takes a second. There we go. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jason Prevost. I'm the Senior Acquisitions Editor for Social Sciences and International Relations at Brill, and we're here together tonight to celebrate the International Journal of Social Imaginaries and our authors on the topic of Ricoeur. And with that, warm welcome. I will yield the floor to the journal editors and the participants. Enjoy.
Thank you very much, Jason, and thank you to Brill for hosting this event. I'm Susie. I'm a coordinating editor of the International Journal of Social Imaginaries. This is our third Meet the Authors event, and we're so thrilled to be able to continue this, what is fast becoming a tradition for us. And we're so delighted today to be speaking with George Taylor, Saulius, Geniusas and Jean-Luc Amalric in relation to the publication of Paul Ricoeur's Lectures on Imagination. These lectures were presented by Ricoeur in 1975 at the University of Chicago, and they've just been posthumously published earlier this year, simultaneously in French and in English. They're a companion volume to the Lectures on Ideology and Utopia, which were also presented in 1975 at the University of Chicago by Ricoeur, and where the Lectures on Ideology and Utopia are his lectures on the social imaginary. In the Lectures on the Imagination, we get the more core ideas around his understanding and his untangling of the reproductive and productive imaginations, his approach to creativity, and his articulation of the productive imagination as fiction. This is a very important event for the journal, and in our first issue of this year, in volume 3.1, we published two articles on Ricoeur's Lectures on Imagination by George Taylor and Saulius Geniusas, respectively. And in our first issue of next year, Jean-Luc Amalric will be writing a response to these essays, and we will be previewing his response today. So indeed, we're very fortunate. I'm very delighted that we are able to hold this event today. A side note, it is adjacent, as it were, to the Ricoeur Society annual conference, which is being held this year at the University of Chicago, with the imagination as its key theme. So we're delighted to be able to contribute to the ongoing discussions in the Ricoeur circle and in the wider public sphere on these issues. So I would like to briefly just outline how we will proceed. The seminar will go for approximately an hour. Our two, George Taylor and Saulius Geniusas, will each speak for 10 minutes on the topic of their papers that were published in the journal, and then Jean-Luc will respond. And then we will open up the floor to participant questions and discussions, and well, I'm very, very excited. So allow me please to introduce George Taylor, Emeritus Professor of Law at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's the editor of both the Lectures on Ideology and Utopia and the co-editor of the Imagination Lectures. He is currently writing a book on the religious imaginary in Ricoeur's thought, and he is a valued friend of the journal. We're very pleased to host George today, and he will be speaking to his article entitled The Depth Dimension of Ricoeur's Philosophy of Imagination. Thank you, George.
Okay, thanks very much, Susan. Thanks everyone for attending. So as Susie indicated, I'm going to provide a summary of the paper in the time allotted. So in the paper, I focus on the grounding of the productive imagination, what I call its depth dimension. The depth dimension of imagination addresses the productive imagination source or sources that transfigure reality. In the paper as published, I developed 3 parts, and for the sake of time, I set aside here the 3rd part on the religious imagination, and I'll be addressing the religious imagination in some of my discussion for the conference tomorrow. Ricoeur is quite direct in the lectures on imagination that he wants to challenge the leading sense of imagination in the history of the West, where the imagination has been deemed to be necessarily reproductive because derived mainly from perception. Under that approach, perception apprehends objects in the world, and imagination derives from perceptual images. Reality lies in the objects, and imagination is reproductive as a lesser variation on an object. The paper's first substantive part seeks to show Ricoeur's rejoinder to this claim. While, as I shall explain, Ricoeur does not consider the depth dimension of imagination as much directly in the lectures on imagination, but rather elsewhere, we do find significant clues to this dimension in what Ricoeur does address in that text. A few examples from the text help show what is at issue. First, Ricoeur develops how for Kant, the productive imagination is necessary as a mediation between the separate realms of sensory intuition and the intelligible. Sensory intuitions are the realm of the manifold. Our sensory impressions are scattered and need organization by the intelligible or conceptual. In some brief asides, though, Ricoeur questions whether, as a phenomenological matter, the manifold can ever be said to exist independently from the intelligible. So he asks, where is there a manifold? He uses the example of a child's first experience, such as recognizing the face of a parent. That's already a matter of a pattern, a bridge between the impression and the conceptual. Later, in an aside during his discussion of Wittgenstein, Ricoeur criticizes Kant for assuming the availability of intuition and the understanding as separable, while we are always in situations, he says, where we are both thinking and seeing. Ricoeur concludes that the experiential and linguistic must be conjoined. There is always an exchange, he says, between the linguistic layer of our experience and the pre-linguistic, purely experiential level. Ricoeur finds this mediation in the productive imagination. All reforms, he says, occurring within the problem of perception have, in fact, their counterpart in the theory of imagination. We can no longer oppose imagining to seeing if seeing is itself a way of imagining, interpreting, or thinking. Later, in the second part of the lectures, Ricoeur wants to show an interrelation between phenomenological and analytic approaches to the imagination. Here, too, the underlying objective is to demonstrate the interconnection between experience, which is the supposed hallmark of phenomenology, and conceptual meaning, the supposed center of analytic philosophy. If perception and thought are intertwined, then imagination is not reduced to being derivative of a perceived object. The linguistic or meaning side of perception allows a role for the productive imagination. Ricoeur pursues this depth dimension of imagination more directly in the lectures on ideology and utopia, and then in the first volume of Time and Narrative, where in both cases he argues that symbolic meaning is interwoven into the fabric of social life. Social life is not physical objects, but objects and actions that have meaning. In human life, a non-symbolic mode of existence or non-symbolic mode of action cannot obtain. The symbolic structure of action, he says, is absolutely primitive and ineluctable. In Time and Narrative, he offers an example that he often returns to, the implications of raising a hand, and Saulius also refers to this example in his paper. Depending upon context, the hand raised can mean a greeting, an invitation, for example, to come or to stop, a threat or a vote. Meaning and action are linked. In the vocabulary of Time and Narrative, human action as symbolic is always already prefigured. This is mimesis 1. Ricoeur contends that symbolic mediation as prefiguration offers a form of pre-signification that opens its capacity for productive imagination. The linguisticality of action, its symbolic articulation, allows for the realm of productive imagination. The second part of the paper turns to other ways in which the productive imagination can manifest. This part builds on work undertaken separately by Alice and Scott Bowman and Jean-Luc on the role of the negative and negation in Ricoeur's earlier work, and I consider the implications of these themes in the lectures on imagination. Those lectures are replete with references to the negative, negation, and the nowhere. Ricoeur explicitly states in this volume that the negative always is haunting the field of imagination. As I pursue, Ricoeur's phenomenological theory of intentionality involves negation as a first step toward an opening toward fiction as ontological insight. In imagination, we have consciousness of the imagined, which is something bracketed, suspended, as if, what he calls a nothingness in the appearance. The imaginative image exists, but it exists nowhere. It posits nothingness. For Ricoeur, phenomenology's fundamental contribution in this field may be to make nothingness a phenomenological feature of the imaginary. This theory acts as a negative condition for remaking reality. Discussion of symbolic mediation from the first section now aids to the weight of this analysis. Reality could not be remade if reality consisted simply of the object world around us as static facts. The world must permit being reconfigured, being reimagined. Symbolic mediation permits this conjunction between experience and meaning. Symbolic mediation in the world and imagination in its aesthetic origin interrelate. On the one hand, Ricoeur wants to retain in fiction the nothingness of imagination, its non-being. Again, this offers an alternative to imagination as reproductive, as a residue of perception. But fiction is not simply separation from reality, not simply unreality, as it can inform and rework reality. The fundamental problem of imagination, Ricoeur says, lies in the conjunction between the not, the negation, the unreal, and the like, something affecting the real. The productive imagination is unreal, but not ultimately so. Ultimately, it can become the like real. The farthest reaches of Ricoeur's philosophy of productive imagination extend to an ontology of nothingness. In a theory of fiction, Ricoeur argues the negative element is the key to the referential power itself. Thanks to fiction's negativity, it discloses new elements of reality. Because fiction is not bound to an existing referent, an existing external reality, it can disclose to the nothingness of the fictional referent a new referent, a new reality of its own. I'm particularly intrigued by the notion of the nowhere and intended as potentially exemplary of Ricoeur's themes about imagination and negation. First, the nowhere seems to designate a sense of location that paradoxically is no place, yet also a point of origin, a place of extraterritoriality. Second, the nowhere is a topic that extends in Ricoeur from the lectures on imagination to the lectures on ideology and utopia, and to his 1976 essay, Imagination in Discourse and in Action. Each of these texts refers to the utopia as the nowhere. These texts explicitly connect utopia and the nowhere with fiction. The utopia has the fictional power to describe life. Fiction, Ricoeur says, is directly elsewhere, even nowhere. But because it designates the non-place in relation to all reality, it can indirectly cite this reality. So the utopia allows us to discern the more overt connection between symbolic mediation, the subject of the paper's first section, and the productive imagination as the fiction of the negation, the nowhere, the subject of the second section. The interrelation between meaning and experience in symbolic mediation allows the space for symbolic variation within reality that includes the nowhere, the elsewhere, the not yet real. The nowhere is a source of imagination's depth dimension. Imagination's depth dimension shows how reality is remade, is transposed. So productive imagination for Ricoeur is not secondary or derivative, but participates in the very nature of being itself. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, George. Thank you. Thank you. We'll move now to our second presenter, Saulius Geniusas. Saulius is Professor of Philosophy at the Chinese University of Hong Kong, and he has been, up until very recently, for several years, a member of the editorial collective of the Social Imaginaries editorial collective, and continues to be a valued friend of the journal and project. Saulius has a special interest in Husserl and more broadly in the phenomenology of the imagination, but not only the imagination, phenomenology of instances that don't often receive attention. So he seeks out the unusual that has not received phenomenological attention, and the imagination is prime in that situation. He's published a paper with us on Ricoeur's lectures, to which he will speak today. It is entitled From the Phenomenology of Reactivation to the Hermeneutics of Innovation, Paul Ricoeur on Sedimentation as the Dialectical Counterpart to Productive Imagination. And before I ask Saulius to begin, I would just like to note that this is part of a trilogy of articles or essays that Saulius has written on sedimentation recently. He has also written an article each on Husserl and Merleau-Ponty, which I encourage you to read as well. Thank you, Saulius.
Thank you very much, Susie. It's a pleasure for me to take part in this session. Let me just jump into it, given the shortage of time. Ricoeur is the philosopher of the productive imagination. This is a claim that we often come around in the literature. So, of course, the fundamental question that we need to ask here is, what exactly is meant by the concept of productive imagination, especially in the context of Ricoeur's works? Well, to clarify this concept, for the most part, the common strategy, the very one that Ricoeur himself follows, is to capitalize on the distinction between productive imagination and reproductive imagination. And this is, of course, crucial. But I would also say that such a strategy only partly clarifies the meaning of productive imagination. So besides drawing a distinction between productive and reproductive imagination, we must also draw a further distinction between productive imagination and creative imagination. And that's one of the issues that George Taylor also addresses in the editor's introduction to the lectures on imagination. So these two concepts, productive imagination, creative imagination, they are not the same. And so as to clarify the difference between them, that's where the concept of sedimentation that I focus on becomes crucial. So Ricoeur himself addresses the distinction between these two concepts in a discussion with Cornelius Castoriadis in 1985. So productive imagination, of which Ricoeur speaks, is not the same as creative imagination, of which Castoriadis speaks. Ricoeur puts it this way: creative imagination is characterized by unbound freedom. Well, as Castoriadis himself puts it, it creates ex nihilo. Now, by contrast to that, productive imagination, of which Ricoeur speaks, is always already contextually situated. It functions only insofar as it relies on the available resources at the disposal. So as Ricoeur puts it in this discussion, he says, we do not produce everything in what we produce. A very nice way of putting the matter. So just as we need to draw a distinction then between productive and reproductive imagination, we also need this other distinction between productive imagination and creative imagination. So this is then what I try to understand in the paper that I published in the journal, and I aim to show that in Ricoeur's hermeneutical phenomenology, sedimentation is an umbrella term that constitutes the dialectical counterpart of productive imagination. So as Ricoeur puts it in Time and Narrative, he says, the labor of imagination is not born from nothing. And this I interpret to mean productive imagination is always coupled with sedimentation. So productive imagination does not create ex nihilo because its productivity relies on sedimentation, and that's where the difference between those two fundamental concepts lies. So for as long as we do not reflect on sedimentation, then we have only a partial understanding of productive imagination. And this explains why it is important to address sedimentation in a volume dedicated to Ricoeur's concept of productive imagination. What then is sedimentation? Well, not an easy question to answer, especially in brief. As Susie just mentioned, I have been trying to explore the meaning of this concept in a variety of frameworks, especially in the phenomenological tradition. This concept is heavily overdetermined. It has a number of different meanings. So here in this paper, I'm concerned with two issues. So how is sedimentation understood in classical phenomenology and especially in Husserlian phenomenology? A focus on Husserl because the concept of sedimentation obtained philosophical meaning in Husserl's writings. And afterwards, I turn to the second question. How is sedimentation understood in hermeneutical phenomenology and especially in Ricoeur? So regarding the first question, here is what is crucial. In Husserl, the concept of sedimentation is coupled with that of reawakening or reactivation. And here I employ these concepts as synonyms. But I want to stress that there are different forms of reawakening, different forms of reactivation. Three of them are of central importance. So first, awakening can be understood as recollection. Now, besides that, second, it can also be understood as schematization or as typification, to use Husserl's own concept. So when I see a dog and recognize a dog as a dog, I do so on the basis of my past experience, which has sedimented into my consciousness. And then lastly, reawakening can also be understood not merely as the reawakening of what one has already lived through, so not merely as the reawakening of my past experience. We can also reawaken what others have lived through. And Husserl's favorite example for that is the Pythagorean theorem. This is, according to Husserl, the miracle of all miracles. I can have the same evidence with the insight a square equals b square plus c square as the ancient Greeks whom I never met. Hermeneutically, this is extremely interesting, for we are faced not merely with sedimentation in consciousness, but with sedimentation in language. This is material sedimentation, if you will. Language is the carrier of meaning. Now here, I don't want to go into any further details about Husserl's concept of sedimentation. So let me turn to the second question. How about Ricoeur? How about Ricoeur's concept of sedimentation? So here, the first thing that I want to emphasize is this. Most hermeneutical thinkers do not employ the concept of sedimentation. And by this I mean that neither Heidegger nor Gadamer does. But by contrast to them, Ricoeur employs this concept, and in various contexts, in various texts. So in this regard, just textually, he is closer to Husserl than Heidegger or Gadamer. That being said, Ricoeur employs the concept of sedimentation differently, not only from Husserl, but also from other phenomenologists, such as Merleau-Ponty. So much like Husserl, Merleau-Ponty also employs the concept of sedimentation alongside that of reactivation. Ricoeur employs sedimentation, this concept, but he drops the concept of reactivation or reawakening. He replaces the concept of reawakening with that of innovation. And this motivates us to ask a number of questions. So how are we to understand this change of terminology? Why is the concept of reactivation out of place in Ricoeur's hermeneutical phenomenology? Why is this concept replaced with that of innovation? So these are then the questions with which my paper deals. Ricoeur does not employ the concept of reactivation, I would say, for two central and interrelated reasons. The first has to do with what Ricoeur identifies as the surplus of meaning. So precisely because texts are characterized by such a surplus, the reactivation of meaning turns out to be an interpretive activity through and through, which in effect means that their reactivation is an innovation. So here you can recall Ricoeur's contention that as a rule, the meaning of the text goes beyond the authorial intention. Now, the second reason concerns inexact essences. Ricoeur was especially drawn and attentive to the distinction between exact and inexact essences that he came across in Husserl's writings. So building on this distinction, he claimed that his hermeneutical phenomenology was concerned with inexact essences. There is something deeply creative about inexactness. When I understand something inexact, I cannot merely reproduce what others have said. I must find my own way. My understanding inevitably proves to be innovative. Now, the concept of innovation is indeed better suited for Ricoeur's goals than that of reactivation or reawakening. It is better suited to express the interpretive activity that characterizes the reappropriation of meaning. It is better suited to describe our exposure to the surplus of meaning. It is better suited for a philosophy which is committed to the view that to understand is always to understand differently. And it is much more closely tied to the concept of productive imagination. Now, all of this led me to a further question central in my analysis. How are we to understand the relation between phenomenology of reactivation and the hermeneutics of innovation? I have little time left, so let me emphasize that I distinguish between different ways to understand this relation. But what I capitalize on is that reactivation is a necessary condition that makes innovation possible. So what we have faced here is the project of grafting hermeneutics onto phenomenology. Well, besides that, another issue that I cannot address today in my paper concerns Ricoeur's analysis of the three mimesis in time and narrative, something that also George Taylor addressed in his presentation. So here also I bring together the concepts of sedimentation and productive imagination in this framework. So I suggest that in Ricoeur we have a circular conception of that of sedimentation. The circle concerns, it's a productive circle between sedimentation and productive imagination. And let me just conclude by saying that this circular interrelation of productive imagination and sedimentation is exactly what allows us to draw a distinction between these two central concepts, namely productive imagination and creative imagination. Okay, I finish here. Thank you.
Thank you, Saulius. Thank you. Well, wonderful. Such rich presentations by George and Saulius. Thank you so much. They've set up the discussion and response superbly for Jean-Luc. And please allow me to introduce Jean-Luc. I'm so very thrilled that Jean-Luc is able to participate. So thank you to the Ricoeur conference organizers for inviting him to Chicago as a keynote speaker so that we could piggyback on that invitation and include him in this webinar. Jean-Luc teaches at the École des Hautes Études en Sciences Sociales, and I have attended one of his seminars on the imagination, and it was a wondrous experience. He's a former editor of the bilingual Ricoeur Studies Journal and co-editor of the English edition of the lectures on imagination with George Taylor and others, and also the translator and editor of the French edition of the Imagination Lectures, which was published by IJSI simultaneously as the English editions with an appendix on Kant. George Jean-Luc is a renowned scholar on the imagination and on Ricoeur, and his response that he will be delivering today might foreshadow some of his written response that we will be publishing, as I mentioned, in our first issue of next year. So I warmly welcome Jean-Luc and look forward to hearing his response to these very rich papers. Thank you, Jean-Luc.
Thank you very much, Susie. It's a pleasure for me to talk with you again.
Yes, lovely, so lovely.
It's not in Paris, but it's a pleasure. Well, what I want to say first is that I completely agree with George and Saulius' analysis. For this reason, I'm not going to discuss their thesis. I would rather try to extend and to deepen their reflection on Ricoeur's theory of imagination. Despite their different approaches, George and Saulius' contribution converge in the importance they both confer on the theory of the threefold mimesis that Ricoeur develops in chapter 3 of Time and Narrative 1. 8 years after the lectures on imagination and the rule of metaphor, it seems that Ricoeur delivers in this text the most elaborate exposition of his conception of productive imagination through a radical renewal of the concept of representation, now conceived as a process of figuration and as a process of creative mimesis. What seems most interesting to me in this productive circle of prefiguration, configuration, and refiguration, constitutive of a threefold mimesis, is that Ricoeur gives us for the first time to think of what I would call the life of productive imagination. It is on this life on productive imagination in its historical, ontological, and practical dimension that I will focus the few analyses I wish to develop now. How Ricoeur does come to think for the first time this life of productive imagination. I think we can understand the profound novelty of the theory of the threefold mimesis in relation to the rule of metaphor and to the lectures on imagination, if we analyze the strong revision that Ricoeur makes to the Kantian conception of the transcendental. In the lectures on imagination, as in the rule of metaphor, when Ricoeur insists on the transcendental dimension of productive imagination, it is because he is attempting to elaborate a new theory of semantic imagination, which would be freed from all forms of psychologism. His insistence on the transcendental status of metaphorical schematism and his analysis of the language strategy at work in metaphor intend to show that the true function of productive imagination is irreducible to the empirical function of imagination as the evocation of the absent. For Ricoeur, productive imagination must be defined as the creative function of seeing us. But if we want to be able to think the metaphorical reference, that is what Ricoeur calls the productive reference of metaphor, we can't stay at the level of a semantic theory of imagination and at the level of phenomenological psychology of imagination. We must link these semantic and phenomenological approaches of productive imagination to the theory of the social imaginary that has been developed on the lectures on ideology and utopia. In the theory of the threefold mimesis, the analysis of prefiguration, mimesis 1, is so important. Why is it so important, as George rightly stressed? It is because it clearly shows that the fictional power of invention, of productive imagination, lies on the symbolic mediation of action. Symbolic mediation always already accomplished by the social imaginary in its constitutive and originary dimensions. In this sense, I agree with Saulius when he says that Ricoeur's theory of the historical dialectic of innovation and sedimentation implies a strong revision of the Kantian conception of the transcendental. To define the transcendental implied in Ricoeur's theory of the three mimesis, I would use the expression of transhistorical quasi-transcendental. The Ricoeurian transcendental is not anhistorical as the Kantian a priori, but transhistorical. And the transhistorical corresponds precisely to the work of sedimentation. In that sense, in Ricoeur, metaphor and narrative are not simply a trope or a literary genre, but they are, as Ricoeur himself says, transhistorical structures of discourse that rules the schematism of the productive synthesis of imagination, that is, the schematism of innovation. I think Ricoeur tries to think a dialectic between structure and event, and productive imagination is at the same time what produces the synthesis of the heterogeneous and the matrix of this synthesis. My contention here is that Ricoeur's theory of a transhistorical productivity of imagination can be interpreted as the Ricoeur's response to structuralism. In this sense, thinking the transhistorical life of imagination, it is thinking an ontological productivity of imagination, which is irreducible to an ahistorical logical combinatorics. One may recall here that in his discussion with Lévi-Strauss, Ricoeur speaks of a transcendentalism without subject when he tried to characterize Lévi-Strauss' approaches. The response to Ricoeur is transcendentalism with historicity and subjectivity. Mm-hmm. And to conclude this observation, I would like to stress, to finish my reflection, to stress the central role of Ricoeur's philosophy of productive imagination in refuting the objection of a vicious circle of the threefold mimesis. For Ricoeur, we have to do with two opposite objections to the theory of the creative mimesis. On the one hand, we have the idea of the violence of interpretation. Interpretation would correspond to a pure fiction that would give an arbitrary form to a formless matter. it would be a pure productive imagination starting from nothing. On the other side, on the other end, we would have a pure redundancy of the interpretation, and imagination here would be a repetition, a kind of reproduction of what has been already narrated. I think the recurrent concept of creative mimesis is a response to this objection. The crucial condition for this creative mimesis to be possible is a certain conception of prefiguration as resulting from sedimentation. I conclude. My contention here is that Ricoeur's theory of productive imagination implies a theory of the virtual, what I would call the virtual. The virtual understood as productivity already preformed. Simondon would say pre-individualized. In this sense, when it's what Ricoeur means when he speaks of inchoative narrativity or virtual narrativity, it means that the productivity of imagination as virtuality is what allows us to think a creativity of fiction, which is not only a pure invention, but at the same time, a kind of discovery. Ricoeur attempts here is to preserve a kind of tension between act and experience, between negation and affirmation, and between invention and discovery. It's this tension, constitutive tension between invention and discovery that for me express the virtuality of productive imagination in prefiguration. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jean-Luc. Thank you very much to our three presenters. Oh, I like the virtual hand clapping that I can see there. That's wonderful. Well, I think we open it now to the floor, to the virtual floor for discussion and questions. I hope that I will be able to tell if someone has raised their hand. I can't see all the participants. So Nathan has a question. Please go ahead, Nathan.
Thank you all for the presentations. This was really great. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Okay.
Thank you.
I had a question for George. I want to go back to when you were focused on the nowhere. You started to make clear why of all the negative concepts, you focus on nowhere rather than nothingness or something like that. I think I just am asking for why the nowhere, right? Like you say, I think you said something about that there's this kind of location, this extraterritoriality.
Right.
Why go that route?
Yeah, thank you for the question. And I think it's not to prioritize the nowhere over the negative or so forth. I think sometimes there is a tendency to take the negative as something, as a negation of something else, sort of a dialectic, and the nowhere takes us away from that. Is sort of a place elsewhere, otherwhere or nowhere, and so it is trying to open up that sphere as something as innovative that comes out in terms of somewhere new. And it also, for me, and this ties back to my work on the lectures on ideology and utopia, it is not simply a literary figure, the literary utopia, but the, in fact, social or political utopia as the nowhere. And so it brings those spheres more together. I think that would be my emphasis.
Thank you. Thank you, Nathan and George. Kana has a question.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, we can.
Thank you for the talks. I have a question based on Professor Geniusas's, I think, chapter on Ricoeur in one of the imagination books. And I'm going to try to link it to the discussion here because all three of the speakers mentioned how it is for Ricoeur. Imagination is connected to perception, and there is this dimension of seeing as, and also, so in that chapter, if I'm correct, I think Professor Geniusas was addressing towards a tension between the phenomenological tendency in Ricoeur's account of imagination and the hermeneutic tendency. And he was distinguishing it from the Merleau-Pontian account of imagination. So instead of basing his account on pre-predicative perceptive realm, domain, so language was prioritized. I think this was your take. So in terms of, so what I wanted to ask is there any way to reconcile those two tendencies, or do you see them mutually exclusive? Or I'm asking this because I'm working on Merleau-Ponty and Ricoeur on imagination, and I'm trying to read coherent deformation in Merleau-Ponty and impertinent predication together. I'm trying to see if, you know, what might be approaches I can explore. Thank you.
So,
Yes, thank you very much for this question. It's a very rich question. It's certainly not easy to answer it just in a few minutes. I would say it's completely impossible. And you know, what is really in question, I would say, is it's important, I would emphasize, to avoid simple solutions. And the simple solution would be, you know, quasi Hegelian solution in this pejorative sense of the term, the way sometimes people use this concept, where a certain philosophical tradition is itself absorbed within another tradition. All the problems are resolved just, you know, with an easy trick that is introduced somewhere. So these are, you know, two significantly, I would say, different conceptions that we come across in the history of phenomenology. I myself am more interested in the differences, not so much between Merleau-Ponty and Ricoeur, which is a very interesting issue to address, but more so between Husserl and Ricoeur. But the fundamental difference here, of course, would be the question that concerns the significance of language, its breadth, when it comes to our possibilities of conceptualizing what fantasy or imagination is. So Ricoeur's, you know, move, especially after the lectures, because in the lectures, the approach that he takes is more phenomenological than in his later works. Ricoeur's move to address imagination within the framework of language introduces a significantly different conceptual framework to think about imagination. So I leave my answer very broad and indeterminate, just because there is a plethora of issues that come up, you know, when addressing these, this interrelation. But I would especially caution against reducing the differences in too quick a way.
Thank you.
thank you very much, Kana and Saul. Other questions? Yes, some. Seamus. Have I, Seamus?
Yes, you have.
Yes.
You have. Thank you, Susie. Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for those amazing presentations and commentary by Jean-Luc. I'm a little bit reticent or reluctant to ask my question. I looked at Ricoeur a couple of years ago, and I'm afraid I'm not going to be able to unpack my question as effectively as I would like, but I'll give it a go, and hopefully I don't lose my train of thought. I really appreciated, Jean-Luc, your discussion of mimesis 2 and implotment and the sort of the way the productive imagination operates in some ways like a sort of historicized version of the Kantian productive imagination to complete that synthetic function on the kind of disparate, inchoate set of elements that one might encounter in real life or in a text, and bring them together into a coherent unity. And what I was sort of interested in is it seemed to me in my reading of Ricoeur that in that movement from mimesis 2 to mimesis 3 and that refiguration, I don't know if this is a conventional understanding, but maybe it is, but I understood what Ricoeur was getting at for that refiguration to occur in something like the kind of Heideggerian understanding as projected possibility. So something of a refiguration of one's own sense of potential for projected possibilities, projects into which one could move. But in the Ricoeurian sense, those potentialities understood as sort of potential narratives, if you like. And so what I was sort of interested in is if indeed something like that happens and there's this sort of refiguration of Heideggerian potentiality in the subject, in the movement from, or the closing of the circle from mimesis 3 back to mimesis 1, I was interested in whether it would seem that through that act, is it possible that what is reconfigured is not just one's own sense of possibility, but does those very schema or set of rules in the productive imagination, does that in turn get refigured to whatever extent, however small, however large? Is that sort of what can be refigured through a decisive, original, creative, imaginative act of implotment? Does one refigure not just one's own sense of possibility, but refigure one's own schemata through which acts of implotment can occur? I don't know if that's a helpful question, but that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, thank you very much for your very interesting question. I didn't have the time to speak of mimesis 3, of the question of refiguration. And I think it's a decisive moment to understand precisely the difference between Ricoeur and Heidegger, or an Heideggerian understanding of the hermeneutic circle. And it's difficult because Ricoeur uses some Heideggerian expression, our possibilities and the question of the inhabitation of the world, and etc. But I think the originality of Ricoeur, and it's not something that appears only in time and narrative, but it appears also in the conclusion of the symbolic of evil. It's this very strange idea of to the question of Ricoeur, how can we get beyond the circle? Comment dépasser le cercle herméneutique? It's a very strange question. I think the only interpretation of this is Ricoeur as a practical interpretation of the circle. And the moment of refiguration is not only the moment of an history of the representative schematism in mimesis 1 and 2, but it's also the moment of the possible connection with the practical schematism. And in this sense, I think there is a kind of discontinuity in this third moment. It's not a real circle, and it's why the question of the interpretation of a circle is very important in Ricoeur, and Saulius stresses it, rightly stress these points. It's, for me, it's the difference between the circle and the spiral. Yeah. Because the circle, if we are in a circle, we are in a classical or classical comprehension of the hermeneutic circle, and also ontologic classical Heideggerian interpretation of the circle. But in Ricoeur, and it's very clear in the lectures on ideology and utopia, it's clearer than in time and narrative for me. I don't know if George agrees with this, but in the lectures, Ricoeur, when he speaks of a spiral, it's not an ontological characteristic. It's a practical possibility. The circle can maybe be transformed in a spiral, but this implies a practical decision. And for me, this stresses the irreducibility of ethics to ontology in Ricoeur philosophy. And that's a point we always return to this point in oneself as another. There is an irreducibility of ethics to ontology. That would be an attempt of response.
Thank you.
Thank you. Does anyone else have a question? I have many, so I have. All right, I will take the liberty as the chair. I have many questions, but I will ask one to each of our amazing speakers to to have the opportunity to hear their reflections and erudition. It's wonderful. So to our first speaker, George, I'm wondering, when we think about the religious imagination, or I would like to broaden that to the religious imaginary in Ricoeur. Ricoeur tends to think of it in terms of, a divine, that there is a hierophany. And I've noticed when reading Ricoeur that he avoids a conversation with Durkheim and the Durkheimian tradition. And I wonder if we shift our understanding of the religious imaginary to a broader understanding of the sacred, which may not necessarily include a notion of the divine a priori, what this might change in our understanding of the religious imaginary in Ricoeur. Yeah. And I'll just what I'll do, George, sorry, I'll just ask my questions to the three of you, and then you can each respond.
Okay.
To Saulius, I'd like to ask, in relation to reactivation, the question of reactivation, in the Castoriadis discussion, and elsewhere occasionally, Ricoeur talks of retroaction. And I'm wondering how closely you might think this is related to reactivation, and what makes it different, and how again this might be linked to innovation in his thought. And to Jean-Luc, I would like to draw on your ongoing interest and discussion with Castoriadis and Ricoeur. And I recall, so what struck me about the presentations was that they found in time and narrative a more, if you like, developed or complete understanding of Ricoeur's notion of the imagination. And the discussion with Castoriadis took place in 1985. If I'm correct, the first volume of Time and Narrative was published in 1983. So 8 years after the 1975 lectures. And I recall George arguing that Ricoeur was closer to Castoriadis's understanding of creation in the 1975 lectures than at the time of Time and Narrative. And I wonder, would you agree with that? And how might that impact on your articulation of creativity in Ricoeur?
Okay, thank you.
So you'd like me to start, Susie?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So your question about the broadening the notion of the religious imagination or the religious imaginary to include the sacred. And I think we could take that in a number of ways. One would be he has an article on manifestation and proclamation where he's partly responding to Eliade in terms of often the sacred is deemed a manifestation of a sacred object, say, in various cultures. And then I think in terms of the Durkheim, in terms of the sociology, broader notion, I think it still would go back, or let me say, I think to see that partly what he's doing is the notion of manifestation itself.
Mm-hmm.
And that can occur in a number of different ways. And I think one of the things he's doing, which I tried to speak to in this last part of the article that I didn't reference, is to give priority to the poetic imagination, where the religious imagination is in some sense a regional form of that. So that manifestation is broader, inclusive of, but broader than the religious imagination. So I think that may be partly responsive to what you're suggesting.
Yeah.
And then it's also interesting that Ricoeur flips it, as I also discussed, to talk about the underlying nature of the religious imagination in the sense of dependence, ultimate concern, and so forth, which for Ricoeur does have more of a, it's not simply manifestation, but there's a religious overtone. And I think partly what's of interest today in the discussion of Ricoeur on the religious imagination, and I'll talk about this in another session of the conference, is that during his lifetime, Ricoeur was accused of being too Christian. And the criticism today, including by very prominent Ricoeurians, is that he's insufficiently Christian because he's too broad in terms of the focus on the sacred or on this ultimate concern or dependence, and he's not affirming specifically the historic resurrection of Jesus as, as Savior, etc. And so that gets tied up. That to me is a quite interesting phenomenon, and then to see how Ricoeur responds to that. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, George. Saul?
Yes, I guess I'm the second one in this row. So thank you very much, Susie, for this question. It's certainly a thought-provoking question. Thank you for drawing my attention to this very interesting concept of retroaction. It's a technical question, so to a certain degree, I'll need to, go through the text again to explore a more precise meaning. So my answer at this point is somewhat speculative, you could say. One thing that I would emphasize in the answer is that in a certain sense, in a good sense, every action is a retroaction. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, action always unfolds against a certain kind of a historical or to use, to introduce a reference to Jean-Luc's response as a quasi-historical background. It has something of the kind. It is formed by our past activities. So our actions are fundamentally different from those of newborn infants, even if they also can be conceived as if they had something proto-conceptual about them. So that's one side of the coin. So there is that historical background against which action unfolds, and in this regard, we can think of action itself as an embodiment of productive imagination. But the other side of the coin is that retroaction is never mere reactivation. It is never mere reawakening. It is never merely repetitive. There is something always innovative about itself, about retroaction itself. So this is where I would position dance itself, by linking the concept of retroaction to innovation that Ricoeur employs in his in Time and Narrative, as well as in other works.
Yeah, thank you, Saul. We agree. So that's nice to hear. And Jean-Luc, if
Yes.
would be so interested to hear your reflection.
Yeah, I try to answer your question. You remember when I was trying to think the difference between Castoriadis and Ricoeur, I was stressing the point that we have a strong critique of the idea of origin in Ricoeur, and it's why Ricoeur resists to think imagination as origin, and always tries to think it as a mediation, or already operating mediation. This for me, it's fundamental. It means that action, it doesn't mean that action exists before imagination. That would be the Marxian thesis of the pure praxis. But it means that action has a constitutive link with imagination, but there is a spontaneity of imagination, what Ricoeur in one text called a noetic autonomy. And what Ricoeur calls the discourse of action lies on the noetic autonomy. It's the productivity of imagination. I agree with George when he said that in the role of metaphor and in the lectures on imagination, Ricoeur go far in affirming the power of reference, of productive reference, of metaphor, and it's different in Time and Narrative. But I would explain this change not necessarily as limitation of a creativity. It's a kind of limitation, but it's, for me, it's the moment, Time and Narrative, when Ricoeur replaces his theory of imagination in a practical dimension. It's why I would say that my interpretation is that Ricoeur tries to think with Mimesis 1 and Mimesis 2 what I would call scales of creativity, or different levels of creativity. And there is an operating creativity in Mimesis 1, and there is a thematic creativity, we could say, in Mimesis 2. But the limit of creativity for me in Ricoeur, it's the conclusion of the voluntary and the involuntary, when Ricoeur says willing is not creating. It's practical. It's a practical limit, and this would be for me the limit of the creative imagination for Ricoeur. It doesn't signify a creativity of action itself.
Oh, yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you to our speakers for these reflections. And we have a final question from Abdullah, and we will close the session with this question.
Hello. If we don't have time, I can skip it.
No, we have. If you could keep it to the point, and we have time, and we welcome it. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you for the talks and the ongoing discussion. As Professor George mentioned religious imagination, I wanted to raise a question, but it is mostly directed to Professor Saulius. Is this distinction between creative imagination and productive imagination somehow related to the distinction between creation ex nihilo and creation ex statis? I'm asking this because we cannot creatively imagine the beginning or the genesis of the universe, but we can in terms of imagining the first thing created from another thing that is already been there, which is sedimentation, I believe. This imaginative investigation always brings us to another being. Children do this more than we do, but we can stop somewhere, always a glacial basis, like a primal waters or a fog or something, as in many mythologies and religious narratives. That seems to be a productive imagination that we have only, not the creative imagination. Am I correct in this line of thought, or just this is my imagination?
Yes, excellent question. Thank you very much for raising it. I very much enjoyed hearing it. I'm very sympathetic to how you think about the matter, and just to strengthen this further, or to run with this further, I would say that here, if we want to extrapolate further this distinction between productive and creative imagination, we can rely on further phenomenological resources to do so. So one of the, you could say, problems, some people say problems, that one runs into in classical phenomenology is the impossibility of thinking the origin of time. Time as such cannot have an origin insofar as we can describe it phenomenologically. Husserl's term for that is the transcendental ego cannot be born. Because the birth itself cannot be described. It's always there. It's coupled in Husserl with another claim that transcendental ego cannot die. For the same reason, just as we cannot think the beginning, we cannot think the end. Yes. So now, if we think of this within a hermeneutical framework, you could say that this very conceptual framework is rethought within the framework of a hermeneutical circle, or rather the hermeneutical spiral, taking into account Jean-Luc's comments. Precisely because the the pure innocent origin from which we begin, or the pure end where we end, these are concepts that first do not resonate in experience. We do not encounter them anywhere, and second, we cannot even think of them properly unless we think of them just speculatively. So this would be my response to a brilliant question that you raised.
Thank you. Any final words from our participants or our speakers?
Just thank you very much for hosting and
Yeah, thank you.
bringing us together.
You're very, very welcome. What rich presentations and discussions. Thank you so much to our presenters and our participants for their thoughtful questions, and to Jason at Brill for hosting us. And what a wonderful seminar. Thank you all so much. And well, we hope to see you again soon. Thank you.
Okay,
Bye.
thank
Thank
you.
you, Susie.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.